to the conceptual framework, where I locate different areas of literature that are nested in the research. I'll follow on with a regional mapping of the value chain, focusing on Kenya, Malawi, and Zambia as the main countries, but noting that the regional reach of the main firms goes beyond these countries across East and Southern Africa. I'll follow on with market outcomes at multiple levels, these outcomes, and conclusions. So by way of introduction, rapidly expanding urban populations combined with somewhat economic growth or varied economic growth across the region, as well as dietary protein requirements, has led to the expansion in industrial production of broiler chickens. And this has led to the transformation of the value chain in multiple ways, including in terms of grain trade, animal feed production, as well as day-old chick supply. So as I go through the presentation, there's a specific slogan that came up at the center that I would like you to remember, which is the power is in the breed and the money is in the feed. So as I take you through this presentation, I would like you to remember that. And so the transformation in the value chain has also meant the expansion of multinational traders and processors across Africa under market liberalization, but also linked to global markets. And this is something that has been presented on in the last couple of days. And lastly, there's also been increased vertical integration stemming from some of these main grain traders down through to the downstream supply of poultry, nested within cross-border concentration, which has arisen through mergers and acquisitions and joint ventures. So in terms of this paper, I draw on literature on concentration, power, and governance, where I find that there's complex regional coordination as a result of corporate concentration, which has led to it being crucial in terms of how the value chain has been shaped, how value is created, and how value is extracted. And centering around this is the issue of market concentration. The findings are that there's exclusion of independent market participants at multiple levels of the value chain across various jurisdictions, and that regional competition enforcement should have broader conceptions of power going beyond the traditional conception of market power in industrial organization literature in order for competition enforcement to be able to address this conduct and this harm. So in terms of the methods and the data, I'll just try and go through this quickly. The paper draws on research that was conducted by the African Market Observatory between 2021 and 2024, which is housed at CRED. I think Dr. Mwemba also touched on the Market Observatory in the last couple of days as well. So the observatory essentially collates primary data on prices at multiple levels of not just the poultry value chain, but other key staple food products. And we triangulate this data across different sources. And in the case of my research, also with the Competition Authority of Kenya's Animal Feed Inquiry in 2024. Prices of inputs for poultry production were collected from poultry market participants, and these were further confirmed through in-depth interviews across the 3 countries that I looked at. And then I applied this data to the main areas of literature, which I will go through now, in order to understand how evolving governance arrangements and relationships contribute to conduct and harm. So in terms of the conceptual framework, I located 3 main areas, which is concentration, power, and governance, looking at these 3 main areas of literature. So starting with agri-value chain transformation, this is an area of literature that has focused on market concentration linked to market liberalization in agricultural markets, but also in terms of the demand side, increasing levels of urbanization, but also changes in consumer tastes and what consumers demand. But what I picked up from this literature is that there's a significant gap in understanding what the role of firms and market power is in terms of the structural transformation of agricultural value chains across borders. The other area of literature is in terms of industrial organization, looking at coordination and power. And I focused quite a bit on the efficiency contradiction, where we know that corporate alliances, networks of relationships, and cross-shareholdings can come together in order to assist with achieving economies of scale and scope in order to provide goods and services more efficiently. But we know that these types of interactions can also increase levels of concentration, where information is much easily shared, and so what this means is that market power can also increase, which with it comes the detriment of the possibility of it being exercised and the exclusion of market participants to the detriment of consumer welfare. So the gap that I found here is that currently, at least in the context of agricultural value chains, and lastly, quite quickly, I looked at power in the context of global value chains, focusing on the typology of power, which looks at various dimensions of power that can come together in essentially tipping the balance of power away necessarily from market power into other dimensions of power that we don't consider in traditional competition economics. So I'll move on into mapping the regional value chain in terms of concentration and coordination. And again, I would like you to remember the slogan: the power is in the breed and the money is in the feed. So at the upstream of the poultry value chain, you have maize and soybean as traded commodities, being the main constituents for feed production, which is important for both the breeding stock, which is the chicks that you grow, but also important for growing the actual chickens that are supplied to consumers. So looking at the processing of soybean, which is one of the most important commodities, even in terms of value, outside of South Africa, it's traded by 4 main companies across the region. And these companies have a regional footing, are integrated into trade and logistics, but also in some cases integrated down into feed production. Now, across the 3 countries that I've looked at, there's about 2 to 4 feed producers that are either integrated or have very close relationships to the processors and the traders of soya. Then you have breeding stock, which again is where the power lies. And if you look at the breeding stock levels of concentration, there's 2 main producers that control the global supply of 90% of breeding stock. Now, the way that this works is that they set up licensing arrangements in different regions across the world, South Africa in itself being its own region, but East and Southern Africa outside of South Africa is another region. And here we see that Zambia has emerged as one of the key hubs for breeding stock, but this is very much still linked to this global levels of concentration where these 2 entities control the supply. And then at the very downstream level, you have broiler production, where in each country there's about 1 or 2 large broiler producers that are integrated throughout this value chain, and then lots of independent producers that rely on this one producer for inputs. So this is where the power lies, in the breed, but because the soybean is such a valuable product, that's where the money or the margins can be earned. Now, in terms of low cost, big exports and high prices, I looked at these 2 main inputs: the breeding stock, in this case the day-old chicks, which is the top chart, and the feed as well, which is the bottom chart. So in terms of the day-old chicks, as I mentioned, Zambia has become essentially a breeding stock hub for East and Southern Africa outside South Africa. And this is something that you can see through this chart in the beginning of 2021, where prices are actually comparable to prices in Brazil as a benchmark, taking into account the cost of trade, transport costs, etc. So prices in Zambia in the first half of 2021 are actually relatively competitive. But if you move along into the second half of 2021, all the way through to August of 2022, Zambian prices increased substantially to meet prices that are those in Kenya and those in Malawi. So the prices in Zambia are not reflective of it actually being a breeding stock hub. And these prices are not the prices that vertically integrated producers receive. These increased prices are prices that are received by independent producers who are not vertically integrated and who rely on their downstream competitors to supply them with inputs. We see the same trend also happening in terms of feed, where prices in both Malawi and Zambia are also competitive in the first half of 2021, in fact matching prices in Brazil, which has come out to be an extremely competitive poultry producer. But as we move into the second half of 2021 and all the way through to 2022, prices in all three countries, in fact, are controlled and are not as competitive as you would have expected. Remembering that those that are controlling these prices are vertically integrated and control the access of these inputs throughout the value chain. So you can see these disparities already coming out where vertically integrated producers are harming their competition who are independent producers. Now I'll move on to exclusionary strategies that I found in the context of this regional concentration, focusing on Malawi. Malawi has one vertically integrated producer that dominates the value chain throughout, at each level. So for example, for the provision of day-old chicks, the producer controls 80% of the supply into the market. Now I compared April to May 2021 to November to December 2021, and there were substantial increases in price in terms of the inputs. But yet, if you compare the average variable cost that was also being supplied to the independent producers, these also increased quite substantially. Yet compared to the large producers' wholesale price, this was still under the price that the independent producers, the costs that the independent producers were receiving. And so you find that in November to December 2021, independent producers actually were making a loss of minus 483 kwacha per bird, per 1.9 kg per bird. But these are not the real costs that the vertically integrated producer was receiving. So what are the mechanisms that were in place in order to have these exclusionary outcomes come out? Firstly, it was about investment and scale. Investments in storage, transport, processing, and licensing linked to, again, the vertically integrated nature of the industry meant that bargaining power and market power was at its peak in terms of supply of inputs. And so these vertically integrated grain traders, processors were able to leverage their scale and networks across the region. Another key issue was information exchange, where there was a formation of a regional association in terms of these inputs, where information could be exchanged within a small group of entities to the detriment of their competitors. This meant that there was a decrease in market transparency that facilitated coordination and maintained market power. And lastly, the coordination of exports. And we see this because in the exclusionary strategies in Malawi, Malawian independent producers did not have the alternative to source from a hub like Zambia, because Zambia also increased the price of day-old chicks, for example, at the same time. So it did not provide for an alternative for independent producers. So to conclude, while large firms have required to reap their scale in terms of scale economies, they can also shape markets through their market power and through also leveraging these other dimensions of power that we don't consider in traditional competition economics. The complex relationships amongst few firms has enabled the control in various ways, which has had unequal outcomes against independent producers, but also been facilitated through mechanisms that were perhaps sanctioned by government institutions, such as restrictions on exports, but also the allowance of these regional groupings and unions. The relationships as well as the multidimensional nature of power, context of power, means that competition authorities are unable to capture these power dynamics with their current frameworks and scope, because we are limited in the fact that we only consider market power as something being detrimental to markets. So the application of this is that it is static in its nature, and that the consideration in how coordination actually takes place is limited. So there's questions around the appropriate rules and institutional arrangements that we can use in order to discipline market power. Thank you.
you very much, Grace. Our next speakers are Pumela Mizweli and Wedzerai Musvoto. Their paper is entitled The Strategic Implications of Maize Trade and Competition within the African Continental Free Trade Area and the BRICS region.
Good. It's perfect. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Our paper's title is Strategic Implications of Competition on Maize Trade within the AFCFTA and BRICS region. Our work really is centered around welfare effects of the AFCFTA, but with the cooperation and membership of African countries within AFCFTA trade regime and BRICS, we are interested in understanding the implications of these multiple partnerships and members of BRICS who are also members of the AFCFTA and how this will affect food trade. Interestingly, it articulates well with the previous paper where the money is in the feed, and we are more focused on the feed in the context of maize trade. I'm just going to look at, with you, given the limitations of time, just the research context, which has been covered quite extensively throughout the conference, and the objectives of the paper that we wrote, as well as the key findings of the paper. And contextually, AFCFTA, as we have heard numerous times throughout the conference, represent the largest trading blocs globally. And it was quite interesting to listen to the speakers this morning from Brazil in particular, indicating that it's a cooperation of countries that are interested in peace and in trade. And BRICS is a maize production powerhouse. And maize is important to the global south because of food security issues. We are starting to see trends where food is being imported in Africa, which means that we are not using our resources to secure our food. For instance, the beauty of this BRICS cooperation is that China in 2023 and 2024 produced the largest quantities of maize after United States, 289 million metric tons, and 129 of this was produced by Brazil. And therefore, from the BRICS countries alone, we command 30% of the world's total production of maize. And Brazil is now in the top 3 and is part of the family, BRICS family. So our paper is more exploratory in nature. We are exploring the strategic implications of maize trade competition within the AFCFTA and the BRICS, and we want to examine the flow, trade flow patterns and competitive positioning and the implications for traders within the AFCFTA. We also want to explore future prospects for regional and inter-regional cooperations. Now, you might, I think most of us are very familiar with the theory, trade creation versus trade diversion theory, put together by Wiener way back in 1950, where it showed that trade creation occurs when an agreement enables production costs with lower partner country, for instance, in the AFCFTA, to use the country costs, or rather the country with lower costs. And when we are able to do that, there is increase in welfare and there's also increase in integration. And the AFCFTA really wants to increase integration. Trade diversion is when a trade agreement shifts imports from a more efficient producer to a lower cost external producer with less efficient production costs. And when we analyzed our work, we looked at whether trade has been created or trade has been diverted and the welfare effects thereof. We used quantitative methods. We basically just looked at the trade intensity indices and comparative advantage calculations, and we used the African Development Bank statistics to analyze the welfare effects, and we looked at the different policies within the region, the FCFTA region and the BRICS countries. These are the key findings. We found that since the advent of the AFCFTA, there has been an increase in trade, albeit very low, only 12.4% increase in intra-Africa trade. You would recall that intra-Africa trade in the past years before the AFCFTA was put in place was around 12%. And now we're talking of around 16% intra-Africa trade, which is way lower than other blocs, such as the EU, which is over 60% in terms of intra-European trade. We have seen an increase, and 44 out of these 54 member states have participated in the AFCFTA trade processes, and the value of trade in 2024 reached 1.5 trillion. So as much as the growth is still low, there is potential. For instance, 40% potential increase in intra-Africa maize trade is predicted by 2030. So the question is, what are the drivers of this increase? Clearly, the AFCFTA seeks to reduce trade tariffs, seeks to tackle the problems with non-tariff barriers, and because of this reduction in tariffs, we have seen increase in agricultural products trade, also the streamlined custom procedures, the improved borderline infrastructure, and a lot of investment that has gone into infrastructure, but most importantly, the enablement, regulatory enablement of countries allowing free movement of goods and people. We have seen a number of countries in the AFCFTA space where countries such as Kenya, Rwanda, Namibia, I think in the near future, where there are no visa requirements for the movement of people. Another key finding is in the area of the fact that BRICS commands global dominance in the trade of maize. In total, we have 500 plus million metric tons of maize produced annually within the BRICS territories that control significant portion of global maize trade. And in terms of individual country positioning, Brazil, as I said earlier, is the world's third largest producer and major exporter. China, as much as it's the second largest producer, it focuses more on domestic use of maize. Russia is rapidly expanding its export capacity. India is also domestically focused and largely moving speedily in being one of the top producers of maize. South Africa is seen as a regional integration bridge, although because South Africa produces genetically modified maize, a lot of countries in Africa are not so keen in trading with South African traders in the area of maize because of the GMOs. It's quite interesting that Zambia, as well as Tanzania, are trailblazing in the production of maize in Africa. And just to look at our analysis in terms of the distinct advantages by regions, we found that there are advantages in terms of efficient logistics systems, especially countries that are not having serious backlogs of logistical transport movement of products via transport systems. We also find there is a favorable climatic condition in Africa that facilitates trade, and the scale advantages in production by the countries I've just mentioned, which is Tanzania, Kenya, Zambia in the area of maize. And the opportunities is that the regional integration potential with now the prospects of a 1.2 billion market size and the prospect of the risks being diversified due to capacities that are being improved and infrastructure improvements, and the growing intra-regional demand. I don't remember conversations of late that don't speak about AFCFTA and its role in integrating markets in Africa. The more you are rushed, the slower you become. So these are the priority areas. Precision agriculture adoption. I think as academics we are seeing that the times for operating in silos where business, agriculture and arts are operating silos are completely gone. There are opportunities in integrating and working with synergies from different academic spaces to improve trade. There's also priority areas such as improved seed variety development, digital platform for market information. Digital markets is going to be, as we have discovered in this conference, highlighted the importance of digital markets in the trading of these staple foods. Agricultural biotechnological cooperation. I think it was quite impressive to hear that the agenda in Indonesia is cooperation first, and this is exactly what the AFCFTA has done for us. It is encouraging cooperation. So the value chain development is another area of opportunity. This has been written extensively in trade facilitation and trade creation papers. In concluding, I just want to highlight a few critical next steps for the reasons of emphasis, because we all know the infrastructure in our global south was not built really to assist small and medium enterprises who are local operators, and therefore government political will is going to be critical in addressing infrastructure gaps in the AFCFTA space. We have a great opportunity to leverage BRICS technological advantages, and the humility I watched everyone saying we are learning, even though we are learning from them. There are also areas where we are experts in, for instance, the discovery of smelting minerals, not using a lot of electricity, is areas for other countries to learn from South Africa. Implement transformative initiative, especially around grain exchange, and strengthen institutional capacity to deal with intra-Africa trade in the area of maize. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Pumela. Our next speaker is Arthur Mahumba. His paper is entitled Cracks or Chasms in the International Merger Review, a note from recent agri-food cases.
Good morning, colleagues. Thank you again for the opportunity to present. So I'm going to present a paper that I co-authored with Professor Simon Roberts. Effectively, we're looking at gaps in international measure review. And I think the context here is that concentration in food markets has increased over time, mainly because of inefficient enforcement in this particular market. And in the main, the key driver here is how international measures are being assessed. And the reason for that is that there's a context in which the global companies are looking at the global context whenever they have these measures. They've got global supply chains. But what we found is that when these measures are assessed, they are assessed within the traditional ways of assessing measures, which is within the national boundaries. So you've got a mismatch in one area where the major parties are looking at the global context, but the assessment is done at a national boundary, and some of the issues that are pertinent in those particular assessments are not being picked up because we are still using the traditional ways of assessing measures in the context of looking at global measures. So this is what we are trying to show, and we picked up a couple of case studies where we're showing exactly this point, and it's important to then understand ways, to gain lessons from this particular instances so that we can find ways to improve the enforcement going forward. And I think in the main, there's almost a mismatch in the way that some of these things are done. In the main, you'll find that the large jurisdictions will be in a place where they're able to even take into account some of the global implication of these measures. So they'll be able to look at the strategic documents, they'll be able to look at the supply agreement that the major parties have across the board, but they'll only assess the implication within their own jurisdictions because of the legal frameworks that are in place. So they won't necessarily be able to look at the implications across the board. And what we've seen in practice is that the smaller jurisdictions are likely to follow on what the large jurisdictions have done in terms of remedies, in terms of the assessment, but those large jurisdictions were not actually concerned about the implication of the measures in the smaller jurisdictions. And the effects are mostly felt in the smaller jurisdictions because that's where you find some of these issues that are pertinent. So there's still high concentrations, barriers are high, and so forth and so forth. So you've got this almost dichotomy where you've got the large jurisdictions that are taking the lead, but in the assessment, they then take into account the effects in the smaller jurisdictions. And because of capacities, because of sometimes you'll find that the major parties are willing to give information to the large jurisdictions, but not necessarily the smaller ones. You've got the smaller ones following on what has been done, but that was not within the context at which the large jurisdictions were looking at this thing. So this is where the gaps are coming to play, and you find that the impacts are far more felt in the smaller jurisdictions because of all these issues that are still persisting. So we're trying to highlight this point by looking at three measures in food value chains that have happened before, just to draw some lessons and also to see how we can move the conversation forward. The first one that we're looking at is in global trading, global grain trading. So just a bit of context here. There's about 5 main companies that are controlling about 70 to 80% of the global trade, grain trading volumes. So although it doesn't appear that there's a single one who's dominant, but when you look at different facets and look at different subsectors and sub-markets, you might find a bit of concentration, highly concentration, and in some cases, there's one that is prominently dominant. But the point is that this market is highly concentrated, and this is the context within which the Banjin Vetera merger happened. So this is 2 global traders. They combine the largest networks of country-grade silos with port terminals, milling processing for wheat, with significant logistics across the different nations. And the asset, which is important, were then in different jurisdictions. So the assets that they held were in different jurisdictions, apart from the EU as well as Canada. So the different jurisdictions analyze the merger within the context of what is currently being done within their own jurisdictions. But the point that we're making here is that you've got this global merger, which has got assets in different places, but when the assessments are being done, they're restricted to the effect within a particular market, and this is where the global leakages are then being lost. So the assessment happened, the authorities looked at the assessment, a few of them had issues. I think it's only South Africa and a few other authorities, credit to the CCSA here, and I see the Deputy Commissioner is nodding here, that impose conditions, but in the main, most didn't find any issues because of the nationalist point of view where they're looking at within their jurisdictions. But these are global suppliers, and given the high concentration here, a bigger role, a bigger viewpoint will have pointed out to the issue that are at play, and maybe the assessment will be a bit much richer if a global context was taken into account. The second one is a fertilizer measure, and before we get to the specific here, just to draw a picture here. So currently in Sub-Sahara, there's little primary production of fertilizer apart from South Africa, a bit in Tanzania, a bit in Zambia. So in the main, it means that the region is a great importer of fertilizer, which means that we rely on international suppliers for fertilizer. The implication for that is that whenever there's a global measure, that directly affects the region because there's no local production. So which means every time there's a global measure in this market, the region will be directly affected. And what the suppliers have done, and this is the work that we've done as CRED, what the suppliers have done is that they actually use 4 main ports when they supply fertilizer into the region. So you've got the 2 ports in East Africa, which is Mombasa and Dar es Salaam. You've got the 2 ports in Southern Africa, which is Beira in Mozambique and Durban in South Africa. So these are the supply chains that they're using to then put into the supply into the rest of the region. You can already see that the supply arrangement are not necessarily designed around nationalistic jurisdictions. So you've got Mombasa, which is in Kenya, which is part of COMESA. Dar es Salaam, Tanzania is not part of COMESA. You've got the Southern Africa context here. So the point that we're making here is that the supply arrangements that are being used by these companies are not in line with the jurisdictions that we use when you assess these measures. And the context, the example that we want to highlight is the SABIC and ETG measure. So SABIC is a global producer. They've got productions outside of the region in different places. ETG is an importer and a blender as well as a distributor. So the measure was assessed by 3 authorities in the region. So it's the Commercial Competition Commission, which looked beyond specific nations because they've got a broader mandate, the CSA, the Commission, as well as the FCC. So all of these jurisdictions assessed it within their own jurisdictions. So they looked at the impact of the measure within their own jurisdictions. But from our research, for example, we found that in East Africa, when they supply the East Africa market, sorry, I don't know what I've done here. Oh, thanks. So when you look at this map again, when they're supplying East Africa, they actually consider Rwanda as well as Tanzania as one market. So when they are planning for imports, they're actually considering that Rwanda and Tanzania is in one market. But when you assess it from the context of the jurisdiction, Rwanda is a commercial country, Tanzania is not. So ideally, when Tanzania was looking at the measure, they should have looked at the impact of this measure in Rwanda as well, because the supply arrangement is arranged in such a way that they're looking at it from that context. Similar, when the Commission assessed the measure, I don't think they took into account the effect of the measure in Zambia, Malawi, and Zimbabwe. And these countries rely on suppliers from South Africa as well as imports coming from Durban. So which means that ideally in an ideal world, the Commission should have looked at the implication of this measure beyond its borders, but we know they can't because of the legal jurisdictions. Similarly, when COMESA looked at the measure, they should have looked at where the supply is coming from, which is in South Africa and through the ports in Durban. And as a result, because of this fragmentation, none of this jurisdiction, and this is not a criticism, but we're just saying we're learning from the lessons. None of these jurisdictions had any issues. I think these were all approved unconditionally without any conditions because of the way the assessment is being taken into account. But the key point that we're bringing into account is that the way it's being assessed is not in line with the way that the companies are arranging the supply arrangements. That's why some of these issues that should be looked much more closely are not being picked up because of the design of the way we assess these measures. The last one that we want to highlight is in poultry, as my colleague has explained earlier on, and I'm not going to repeat some of the stuff that was done there. So this is the Avigen and Harvard measure. So this one is not necessarily about the supply arrangement, it's more about the dynamism in this market and how in a particular context the data can point out to potential issues that might come across in other markets as well. So this was assessed by the CMA as a phase 1 measure, so it didn't raise any issues, so there was no in-depth analysis. And the reason for that is that Avigen was almost concluded to say their markets are different because they were focusing more on conventional breeds, while Harvard was focusing on more on the slow-growing breeds. And as a result, it was thought to say, well, these are in two different markets. There's no much overlap, so there are no issues there. Although when we look beyond, after the fact, there were some indication that in some countries in Europe, there was some, growth of shares in one market, indicating that there is some close substitution between the two. And the way that they're being marketed by the emerging parties themselves is that the one was potentially a potential competitor to the other one. And because of the way it was being analyzed, and because Harvard did not have any operations in Africa, this measure was not necessarily assessed in the continent. But looking back now, we can see that this was a potential competitor. And in that context, if there's a global assessment which was being done to say, let's look at the plans, let's look at what the data that these major parties are sitting on, what they're showing, what the market is moving towards, and some of the findings here, then it was meant to say, if this is where this is going, and it is not necessarily notified in other jurisdictions because we don't think there's an overlap, but with the data that we have, there might be an overlap, which means that these might be potential competitors, and as a result, it should have been assessed in other areas because the effects will have been felt there because you're in effect losing a potential competitor. So this is also the one point that I just want to highlight to say the dynamism also comes into play so that we don't just look at the traditional ways beyond the supply arrangement, beyond the way that the supply arrangement are not necessarily in line with what we do when we assess the measures. There's also a point to say, let's look at what the data is showing in one market to see what is the implication in other markets where it is not necessarily notified because the effects will be felt there because you're actually losing a potential competitor. But because the assessment was done with this narrow focus in mind and it was done in one jurisdiction, then some of these things, and these guys have now expanded across the board. So you find them all over the place. And in actual fact, the effects are being felt now across the board, but they were only done in a particular context because of this static view of the way these things are done. So what are we saying? We're saying that when it comes to mega measures, and these are few and far in between, so they don't happen every day. These are few and far in between. We're actually saying that the current framework, which is looking at it from a point of view of the legal jurisdiction within certain markets, it's not fit for purpose because the supply arrangement are not necessarily done in that particular way. So there's a mismatch where you've got this global footprint, but the assessment is being constrained to a specific jurisdictions. So this has resulted in concentration, and we know that food is important for food security, especially in the light of the global, the climate changes implications. So this is some of the things that are important there. And some of our key recommendation is that there needs to be an ongoing tracking of these cases as well as monitoring the market as well. So the Champa Center has got a program in place where they track some of these things through the anti-monopoly tracker. CRED has done quite a lot of work in also checking the prices and doing a lot of work in the cross-border implication of some of these issues. But at the heart of it is that there needs to be greater cooperation. So, the discussion moves beyond just cooperation, but then what cooperation also helps is that because they are notified in different areas, you might find that the emerging parties are telling different stories across the different jurisdictions. This is where cooperation can fit in that information asymmetry and to be able to know what is the real story. And when some information are being shared in one place to another, then that can be helped to bridge this gap. But clearly there's a need to then rethink about how these things are being assessed given the supply logistics that are being used by these global emerging parties, because currently some of these issues are not being picked up because the traditional tools that are used to assess traditional measures are also used when these mega measures are being assessed, and the effects have got far more great implication, especially in food, which is an important component given food security issues, given climate changes, and given all of these issues. So I think we just need to rethink about how we deal with them, and these are some of the lessons that we're taking through to say, because we now have got a bit of more information, how do you then take some of these issues forward? I mean, I know there was a discussion yesterday to say some of these issues are better dealt with at the regional level, some at the continental level, and we're saying to say, on top of that, some of these issues need a global, collaboration. You need different institutions to collaborate to see what's the bigger picture, how does this impact globally, and how to then make sure that every place where there's a potential effect is being taken into account whilst not losing the bigger picture. Because if you just do a nationality point of view with the national jurisdiction in mind, we're going to perpetuate this issue and not pick up some of the issues that are coming across. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arthur. Okay, and our final speaker is Carissa Mutu Padiachine, who has co-authored a paper with Nawabiza Nonjenja. Her paper is entitled Making Markets Work for Women Smallholder Vegetable Farmers in South Africa. Welcome, Carissa.
And good afternoon to everyone. So thank you to the Competition Commission for the opportunity to present this paper. This is a paper that I co-authored with Nobisa Nonjenja, and it's titled Making Markets Work for Women Smallholder Farmers in South Africa. This project, or the study rather, forms part of a multi-year research study which FED conducted in collaboration with Pakistan. And the objective of the study was really to understand what are the barriers to entry being faced by smallholder farmers in the vegetable value chain, and specifically women smallholder farmers. And the idea was to look at the challenges that these farmers face and try and understand what are the implications for their participation and what are the interventions that need to be implemented to make markets work to their benefit. So why smallholder farmers matter? So in terms of vegetable farmers, they are essential for food security and job creation. Vegetables are grown throughout the country, and they are an important food item to most South Africans, South African households. Within the vegetable value chain, you have a few large commercial farmers, and then you have this multitude of smallholder farmers who continue to find it difficult to operate within this value chain due to various barriers to entry. Now, these barriers to entry for women smallholder farmers in particular are more pronounced. So they continue to face the same challenges as men, but they also face systemic issues and barriers to entry related to insecure access to land, finance, and they also shoulder childcare and household responsibilities, which means that their time is quite limited to invest in their farms. So what that means is that many smallholder women farmers end up being confined to low-value markets. So in terms of our research approach, we conducted over 30 semi-structured interviews with input suppliers, farmers, market agents, and retailers. The farmers were located mostly in Gauteng and Limpopo, and we used a purposive sampling technique targeted at women-led firms in order to try and apply a gender lens to the study, to try and identify what are the issues pertaining to women in particular. Now, during the course of our study, the Commission launched the Fresh Produce Market Inquiry, and this actually provided quite a comprehensive perspective on what was happening within the fresh produce value chain. And in a way, our study overlapped with the Fresh Produce Market Inquiry in a number of aspects. And the inquiry put forward a number of recommendations, 31, I think, to be exact, and these recommendations were quite long-term in nature. And so in this study, what I do is, in this presentation is what I do is I'm going to discuss the findings of our study, and then I will touch on what the Commission's recommendation was on that particular issue, given that it was more of a long-term structural recommendation. And then I'll also discuss the short-term interventions, which we say can help farmers on the ground in the shorter term. So this is the vegetable value chain, and it begins with input suppliers. So input suppliers are your suppliers of seed, fertilizers, fungicides, pesticides, and equipment. And farmers use these inputs to produce their crop. So the crop is then grown, harvested, and then they have
several markets in which they can sell this produce to. So they can sell directly to the end consumer. They can sell to informal markets, which includes your hawkers and your informal traders, or they can sell to formal markets, which we say are your supermarkets and your national fresh produce markets. Within this value chain, there are a number of key challenges, and this includes access to inputs and infrastructure, access to finance, access to supermarkets, and access to national fresh produce markets. And I'll go through each of these in turn. So in terms of inputs and infrastructure, access to land, as you know, is necessary. It's a necessary input into farming, but it's not sufficient on its own. Most of the smallholder farmers who we interviewed struggled to use their land efficiently, and that was really tied to the fact that they lacked essential infrastructure such as irrigation systems, greenhouses, shade nets, and cold storage facilities, which are really critical for maximizing their productivity and ensuring year-round supply. Farming is inherently capital intensive, and so other issues that came up in our study were around the rising input costs related to seeds and fertilizers. For women in particular, though, in terms of inputs and infrastructure, although they may have had access to land, they often did not own the land, and the land was either leased to a male relative or husband, or the land or the title deed was in their husband's names. And that makes it difficult for them in other aspects in terms of accessing finance, to buy the necessary inputs and infrastructure to invest in their farms. So in terms of recommendations, the Commission put forward recommendations for fertilizer in terms of supporting the local domestic fertilizer industry, as well as making seeds available to smallholder farmers. Our recommendation was really more around incentivizing farmer cooperatives to bulk buy. And in this way, this can be done by offering them low interest loans and discounted prices when they bulk buy. Now, for women in particular, that's really important, because when they struggle to access finance through the cooperative, they would also be able to get the inputs at a much cheaper price. The other benefits of a well-functioning cooperative is that you have the opportunity and the potential for there to be knowledge sharing and training, which most women struggle to get. So once you have access to inputs and infrastructure, you also need access to finance. And for smallholder farmers, they really rely on their personal funds, loans from families, informal loans. And that's not to say that government support is not available. Government support is available, but they find it challenging to access. And that's really linked to this issue of needing to have collateral to access financing. They lack some business skills in terms of having up-to-date financial statements or bookkeeping skills. They also find the application processes to be quite complex and bureaucratic. Now, there is a need for continued patient finance, which is long-term, low-interest funding, tailored to the agricultural cycles of farmers. But what's also important is that these funding programs need to take into account that women farmers often don't have collateral. So this means that they're unable to then access that finance. And so the Commission also recognized that there was a need to fast track the implementation of the blended finance scheme. And so over and above, having tailored financial products that have some flexibility around issues on collateral, there's also a need to streamline application processes for farmers, making it easier for them to access financing, and also make available financial literacy programs. And this is especially important for women where there is this knowledge gap. So once you have access to finance, farmers need a market, and supermarkets for farmers are seen as a valuable route to market. So supermarkets, however, impose stringent quality standards and certification requirements on farmers, and one of which is Global Gap. Now, Global Gap, to give you context, at a minimum can cost 70,000 Rand, which for most smallholder farmers can be difficult for them to afford. It's not to say that these requirements are bad in any way. These requirements, the quality standards and certifications, are needed by supermarkets, but more needs to be done to assist smallholder farmers to be able to access supermarkets as a route to market. I think the Commission also recognized this within their recommendations, and they put forward that these supply development programs need to be strengthened for smallholder farmers. Women farmers, however, I think the additional issue here is around their time and flexibility. So you need supply development programs to be able to offer them offtake agreements and support in terms of funding to get inputs. And this would go a long way to make these accessible to women. But it still impose fair and standardized terms on them. Policymakers could also try and incentivize your supermarkets to try and compel more inclusive sourcing at supermarkets. So if smallholder farmers can't access supermarkets, they can also access national fresh produce markets. Now, national fresh produce markets historically were created to support smallholder farmers, but they've become a market of last resort. And this has been tied to price volatility and uncertainty at these markets. And most of this is also connected to the role of the market agent. From our interviews, what we know is that market agents decide who they purchase and take produce from. And what we found is that from the interviews, those that had positive experiences were able to nurture those relationships with market agents. And so there's a certain level of bias on the part of market agents in terms of who they preference in the market. And so there's these governance and transparency issues within national fresh produce markets. But for women in particular, it means that they could be open to further discrimination because they may not have the time to nurture relationships with market agents, get to the market on time to do so due to childcare and other household responsibilities. And so the Commission put forward a number of recommendations around trying to improve governance and transparency at the national fresh produce markets. And we concur with these recommendations and say that you do need this transparency, especially within and for agent farmer relationships. So what were the key takeaways? The key takeaways for us is that smallholder farmers continue to be marginalized within the fresh produce value chain. But more importantly, access is not only just about entry, it's also about the sustainability and competitiveness of that entry. The FPMI proposed a number of key recommendations for this value chain, and we've also proposed some short-term interventions. But I think what's really important here is that there has to be gender-responsive interventions. If there aren't, there's a risk that potentially women farmers could be left behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carissa. I will now hand over to the discussants. If you could keep your discussion to 5 minutes for each paper. We'll first start with Professor Boshoff. Please join me in welcoming him.
I'm just going to stand here. Please make a noise if I speak too long. So good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to discuss these three very interesting papers. I'm going to start with the last one, if you don't mind, but just because the way I've read it. So Carissa, Carissa's paper, as you have heard, I mean, it is one that's generated within CRED, which is by now, I think, deservedly has an excellent reputation for its work around value chain. So I am always a little bit careful when I offer my comments, because obviously this is an area where I haven't worked on much. If I look at the paper, it seems to be split. It is split into two parts. So there is a problems part and there's a solutions part. Right? So on the problems part, I think that the paper delivers well. I think, I mean, it sets out a great number of requirements that commercial enterprises have to meet in order to succeed in these markets. And I think that is well described. On the solutions part, I think I would push back a little bit. I think one should ask what outcomes you want. And you're thinking about those outcomes, you need to think about commercial realities. And these two things are in tension almost. So you need scale. You need scale in modern commercial farming, but you also want entry. This is the conundrum. So do you want a large number of new entrants? Probably not. But you want, I think in your last slide you said it well, you want sustainable entry. So, I'm wondering, you don't need to you can't solve the scale problem by telling retailers to buy from a large number of smaller players. I mean, it becomes difficult because there are, of course, a host of reasons they're doing that. They're purchasing from big ones, right? So, I mean, one set of solutions, and perhaps you have considered that, again, it might be reflective of my limited understanding, I mean, is how does one create collectives of these small farms? How do you perhaps pool them in some way? Because farming is a fixed cost business. The number of commercial farmers have declined over time because you need scale. So how can you help the small, in this case, women farmers to overcome that scale issue if you can try and combine them somehow in a larger entity of some sort? And there, of course, you need some public-private cooperation of sorts, because the government's not going to help you better run a farm or a farming operation. So I think one should probably explore, if you think about these issues and problems, which has been very well described, how could one creatively think about such a solution rather than very strict kind of interventions in the ways in which almost putting the burden on the supermarkets to then develop the suppliers, which might be you can't hear me. All right. To develop the supply, I think that is possibly problematic. So that's maybe one thing to think about, Karosa. Let me just leave it at that, because I think it's obviously a complicated area that you know better than I do. But that would just be my consideration with it, so that you don't just take the recommendations from the inquiry, but actually think about other possible ways of addressing the problem. Okay. The next one is the paper by Professor Msweli. Thank you for that. I mean, this is fascinating. So the AFCFTA is obviously, I think, a very important development that we want in terms of, from a competition perspective, to enhance intra-regional dynamism, but also then, of course, boost the position of African producers internationally. And indeed, there is an important literature on how trade agreements actually shape outcomes, market outcomes, and what is the mediating role that institutional issues and so on can play in shaping that. So for me, I offer two, again, general observations, because I know you're probably working from a different angle than I'm used to. So take it from that. So I think the first possible enhancement of the paper could be just describing more extensively what's the nature of intra-regional and kind of external maize production and trade patterns. You do so at a relatively high level. You describe some of them in what you refer to as key finding 1. But I think it would be useful to unpack heterogeneity between countries, within countries, because ultimately we are trying to enhance the ability of small, medium-sized, large African enterprises to perform, to perform better in these markets. So I think describing where we are and describing the export patterns will actually be a useful contribution or addition to the paper. But then secondly, and this is a more broader point, and this is, of course, as some of my colleagues would say, a cheap comment, because I don't write the paper. I can say anything right. So I think the key challenge is reflecting what lessons do we think we can draw from a grouping such as BRICS, which is a quite different grouping to the grouping of countries captured or described by the AFCFTA. The BRICS grouping involves much less alignment. You could just look at how our own country approaches Chinese imports of certain types to understand that there's not as much alignment within BRICS as you would have certainly under a free trade agreement of the type that the AFCFTA has in mind. So we need to think about, and I'm sure there are, but what do we learn from the BRICS countries that can be usefully applied? So that almost pushes you then to individual country-specific initiatives, and one might explore what that means, and how that could then be emulated within the broader AFCFTA region. I think those would be my observations about Professor Msweli's paper. The third one, Grace, your paper on the cross-border markets concentration, specific in relation to certain food value chains, you focus on poultry. I think, again, obviously, clearly, a very carefully written paper, clearly part of that larger research program I've described at CRED with Simon and others. So Grace gives us a well-considered exposition of certain value chains, and then she also offers us a case study of a particular form of anti-competitive behavior with that margin squeeze foreclosure example. So I would make kind of three just observations. The one is your emphasis is on cross-border, but I think you need to unpack the cross-border nature of the markets a bit more. I do see the benefit of relying on different types of approaches, the GFC literature, standard competition economics, and so on. But I think it's necessary, nevertheless, to think a little bit about what are these markets and why are they cross-border in nature? Because you rely a lot on that in terms of making the arguments. I think it would enhance your contribution if you look at the markets that's implied at each level and the geographic scope in each. That was something I was looking for. I think secondly, unpacking the scope would also help us understand the foreclosure. Because my immediate question as a competition economist, if you explain the margin squeeze, which is a very creative and I think very interesting application. So I really like the way you look at the other data and then apply it to the dominant firm. It's just the question is, of course, well, why would it make sense for them to do that, right? And that needs to be answered by looking at the markets. So one would want to almost understand, so what happened at the end of 2021 specifically that created this? So why not before? Is it that somehow one of these independents started really infringing on the market share of the dominant supplier or not? What happened slightly thereafter? Perhaps data is always an issue, but perhaps you can explore a little bit on that. Helps us to understand the foreclosure argument, and it kind of helps you make your case about cross-border, the importance of cross-border markets. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Professor Boshoff. Okay, we're going to hand over to Yongama Njisane, who will give his thoughts on the last paper.
All right. Is this on? Is it on? Oh, okay. All right, good afternoon, everyone. I probably don't need the mic as much. I'm naturally loud. So I'll give my thoughts on the paper that Arthur put together with Simon. And I mean, I think the paper raises a very important question, which I think for all of us, even as regulators, we should be asking ourselves, which is really about how does regional or global market power find expression in local markets? And how does measure control respond to that in light of the kind of regulatory design which necessitates looking at domestic markets? I think this is the real question that I understand you to be asking. And this is an important issue because, of course, as global measures are becoming a kind of a more common occurrence, and I think, as everyone has recognized here, the movement towards the African Continental Free Trade Agreement or Free Trade Area is also accelerating. I think we are likely to be seeing more and more of these. So it's an important question to us. So I think that there's great value in that sense. I think you correctly recognize the constraint around the kind of legislative design. And so I think as authorities, then we ask ourselves then, what then do we do? If the laws are designed such that we must look at domestic issues, how do we deal with this? So you spell out the issue, and perhaps something to consider here in the case studies that you've used. I think there's a little bit more that perhaps we could add to try and frame what the problem is. So you talk about the fact that firms have this regional strategy, and I think that's part of the problem, but also part of the solution. So the strategic thrust for the acquisition may be regional in nature, which means you need to be able to understand what the strategic intent is, but also understand how that then is leveraged into the domestic economy and the impact it has in your domestic markets. Perhaps there's something there that I think in the case study selection that you've done, there's something there to perhaps expand to build the business case for the problem. But also in terms of it being a solution, I think it's an important question for us to understand what the strategic imperative for the transactions are, because in terms of the answers, I think there are really realistically two things which I think you point out, and they are correct. One is, how do we then frame our theories of harm, right? And so understanding the regional strategy that underpins the transaction becomes an important starting point in helping us to frame the theory of harm that we'll be seeing. So for an example, there may be scale economies that rest elsewhere. There might be vertical integration that rests elsewhere. How does it play itself out in terms of its impact in our domestic economy? And so how do we think about how we shape our theories of harm, I think is an important thing to point out. The second solution you propose, which I also think is important, but perhaps there's something there to try and expand on a little bit, is this idea of cooperation, and I think everyone has spoken about cooperation here. And one of the things that tends to perhaps get missed in the solution around you need to cooperate more is really trying to elucidate what is the nature of cooperation that we're seeing here. Because that also has realistic or practical implications for how we do our work. So for an example, we could probably cooperate in so far as we exchange ideas around theories of harm, we talk to each other as authorities, and we try to see where there are commonalities in terms of the theories of harm that we're pursuing and the gaps that we can close. But there might be issues, for an example, around sharing of confidential information, which may limit the ability, so the domestic ability to be able to actually process some of the issues that are identified. There might be questions around kind of the institutional tools and institutional mechanisms that can facilitate that cooperation. And so I think maybe there's something there to dig a little bit more in order to make the solutions also applicable and workable in real life. Then there's another aspect, and perhaps this is the last thought from me. There's another aspect that I think is worth thinking about. And now this is really taking our current context and the world we're going into. And so in the kind of fractured world that we find ourselves in now, and kind of the upheaval in the trade sphere, and how the kind of redesign of the trade sphere is now having implications for competition enforcement. And I think we've thought about it in terms of abuse of dominance and those kind of things, where, for an example, if you look at the kind of negotiations between the EU and the US, we're now bringing competition rules on the table as part of trade negotiations. It's starting off on abuse, but what does it mean for measure control, right? And as countries are becoming more, I suppose, inward-looking and nationalistic, to what extent, how do we foster cooperation? I think is the other question we need to ask ourselves. How do we foster cooperation in a fractured world such as we currently find ourselves in? And that has implications for the kind of, the kind of assistance we can be able to give each other. So I think there's a little bit more that needs to be done in trying to make the proposed solutions real and workable beyond just saying cooperation, and that is the answer. So I think that is roughly it from my side, but it is a very good paper, very interesting, and thanks to everyone on the stage. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Yongama. We have time for questions. So if you have a question, anyone in the audience, if you can, please raise your hand. If you require a microphone, it will be handed to you. Please, can you also indicate who your question is directed to, please?
My question is for the last paper. I was just curious about the poultry merger and why you think that's relevant for your paper. Because you seem to be making a point there more about potential competition and the insights that one jurisdiction might draw from findings about potential competition or competition in another jurisdiction, but it's not clear to me why that implies regional evaluation of a merger.
Thank you very much for these very insightful presentations. I enjoyed all of them myself. And I think they are quite on point, by the way. So I just have one question, maybe for each, right, for each speaker. For Prof. Nsweli, just on this idea of a green exchange, are you able to expand on it and maybe the feasibility of it could be in the BRICS, could be in the developing world, given the other existing exchanges at this moment, right? And to Grace, the idea you ask here about, broader conception of power and harm. I don't know whether are you able to, because this is because we do have a lot of legal instruments, right, around, on the continent. Laws are there, and these laws are not changing anytime soon. So what do you have in mind? Because maybe this could be developed in cases, but maybe still within the constraints of the laws, existing laws. But maybe if you can, help us a bit there. And with Arthur, thank you very much, for your observations. The question I've always had is, and when I look at the framework, you say, well, South Africa looks at the effects, doesn't look at Zambia and other places, but COMESA does look. When COMESA looks, it's not finding a problem. South Africa is not finding a problem. The EU is not finding a problem. Everybody else is not finding a problem. So how should we be dealing with this issue? Because we are not going to have a global authority. Because all of these cases that we have dealt with in the food spaces, in the food market, they have been considered in leading jurisdictions. And I know there's a criticism that maybe South Africa, we should have challenged Measure X, right? But those measures looked at by other authorities, the EU in particular, have been approved. What is left of South Africa when Bayer merges with Monsanto? What can South Africa do? So I just need to get some insights from you on this, on your observations. And with Carissa, of course, I was the chair of the Fresh Produce Market Inquiry, so it's a very interesting that the academics are looking at this work and they are finding the work very useful. So we do appreciate the further consideration of this. Just on, it's really questions, two questions, because they are outstanding, so there are issues that the inquiry could not resolve. Right, so issues around, the conduct of the agents. I think the market, there are still a lot of other things happening in the markets. So I don't know whether you have been able to look deeper into those. But the last point on access to markets, and the discussant is raising this. I think all channels are important, and all channels should be accessible, including the retail channel. And our observation is that the retail channel is a very important channel, but it's not accessible. So I think the issue of access to markets, to me, it still should be a bigger issue, and I think you are flagging it here in your paper, vis-a-vis women. And I think we should take this very, very seriously, and see how do we enable and challenge these retailers to support these farmers. So thank you very much. Those are the questions.
Thank you very much. I think let's pause and allow for answers, and then we will do another round. So firstly, Professor Boshoff's first question. Panel.
Thank you, Prof, for that question. So I think what we're trying to do with that example is to say, when one jurisdiction doesn't pick up the potential competitiveness of a specific measure and everyone else follows in that suit, I think this is where the gap is. So we're trying to identify, to say, because one, large jurisdiction, for lack of a better word, didn't think there was an issue here, everyone followed suit. But had it been thought in the context to say, what if we look at from a potential point of view, what is the implications for other jurisdictions, given that these guys have got a global footprint, but because of the way the market was segmented, that's where everyone stopped in a way. So I think that's the point that we're trying to make, to say, because it was almost taken to say, the CMA found this, so it means they're correct and no one else has to look at it from that context. So I think this is the point that we're trying to make. So maybe we can make it a bit more clearer, but that is the context.
Very much, Arthur. All right, and then over to the questions that the Deputy Commissioner, Mr. Rachisusu, raised. If we can first start with, who was first? Yes, it was Grace, and then we'll go to Arthur, then Carissa, and then Prof. Pumela. So, Grace, your thoughts?
Sure, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you for the question. I think that's quite pertinent because I wasn't able to expand on it in the presentation. And as you rightly so say, there's frameworks, regulations, rules that won't necessarily be changed in the immediate future. So what does that mean in terms of broader conceptions of power? From the literature that I looked at, I'll give an example to explain it easier. One of the areas of power or forms of power that I considered was institutional power. This is in the context of global value chains. And this form of power essentially considers how groups of firms can leverage government regulations, for example, to extract rents. or capture value or create value, right? And from the countries that I looked at, one of the issues that came up is this issue of export restrictions on a commodity such as soya, which is valuable, highly traded across the region, and crucial for this value chain. But the issue became, well, if you restrict the exports, then for some countries that are importers of that, it's like an artificial shortage. But there were a few groups of companies that were included in how these restrictions come about. And so this actually links to Prof. Boshov's question around what happened in 2021. And so what happened in 2021 is that there was an export restriction that was imposed in Zambia. And so this enabled a few group of companies to start to control and speculate what would happen in the market. So that was then leveraged in the poultry value chain at a regional level to say, well, there's a shortage of soya now, so the price is just going to be driven up. And this finding was then translated into the Kenyan feed inquiry, where the Kenyan producers were actually harmed by that. So almost like an artificial shortage, but yet there were some exports that were taking place subsequently into deep sea markets. So it was the ability for these companies to use these institutional arrangements to their own advantage to then capture rents in different markets across the region. So broader conceptions of power would then mean that competition authorities won't necessarily change their regulations for each of these things, but to be aware that companies are involved in some of these decisions that take place. They're aware of how they can extract rents from even regulations that are imposed by governments themselves. So issues like that, I think, would be useful in considering conduct or harm in specific markets. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grace. You can clap if you like the answer. Okay, over to you, Arthur.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner, for that question. So ideally, there should be a global major review, but as you pointed out, that might take some time. But I think practically what can be done at this point in time, specifically on when the theories are being crafted, the theories of harm are being crafted, it's a change of ideas to say, we know the impact will be beyond specific jurisdictions. So how do we bring together the different institutions? So ideally, when AFTA is set up and there's that way to then collaborate with other institutions in the EU and so forth to say, although we still have the legal jurisdiction restrictions, how do we then ensure that the global impact is being assessed across the board? So we're not necessarily losing the nuances that may come across this. And that could, at this point in time, before we get to the global major review, we can almost use that to almost make sure that we're all on the same page, and any dynamics that might not necessarily be picked up from this national jurisdiction point of view are then discussed at that point in time to say, how would you then frame it in such a way that we're taking into account all the effects, even some of them are beyond our jurisdictions, but we try to make sure that the effects are not necessarily being, not necessarily done in a way that at the later stage we'll think that only if we had looked at it from a point of view, we might have taken into account all of those things. So I think that greater collaboration, notwithstanding what Nyongama said about the legal restrictions, issues of confidentiality, but I think the change of ideas in terms of theories of harm, where some of these nuances are lying, and where some of these, supply arrangements, which might not necessarily be clear, because some of them might have holding companies, some of them subsidiaries, and all of this. And so it's just to make sure that we're all on the same page. And I think there are forums like that, where there are always these interactions, and we could take that to make it more practical when we are faced with such measures. And then I think that will then hopefully have a better outcome up until a point where we've got this global review of measures that will take place.
Thanks a lot, Arthur. Is Carissa still online? Would you like to share your answers, Carissa?
Yes, thank you for the question. So in terms of whether further research is being done, so we are in the process of doing that at the moment. And that paper will be released at the end of this year in December. So keep an eye on that. It should be on the CRED website. In terms of the issue about supermarkets, And I think you're right, Deputy Commissioner, in that all routes to market should be accessible for smallholder farmers. I think what we didn't intend is to come across in this paper was that supermarkets should shoulder the burden for all smallholder farmers and that they should shoulder this burden alone. It's to say rather that supermarkets are a valuable route to market. They're reliable, they're consistent markets. And so it's that they have the ability to do more. And I think the issue here is that in terms of supplier development programs, they're often very limited in scale and scope. And these supplier development programs are kind of crafted as corporate social responsibility initiatives, but perhaps should be seen as a core retail strategy to include smallholder farmers within the supermarket. And I understand that there are commercial interests associated with that and issues around that. But it's almost to see it as an investment into the smallholder farmer because that investment will yield a return for the supermarket. And so, and that's why it's also a question of what more can be done to try and incentivize supermarkets to do more. Is there space for government to get involved to help with the issue? And so supermarkets are an important route to market and should be accessible to smallholder farmers. Thank you.
Thank you, Carissa. Over to you, Prof. Pumela.
Yes, thank you, Prof. Jashisusu, for your question, and thank you for your comments, Prof. Bishop. Well, firstly, I think if you want to develop a grain exchange, the first thing you want to think about is building capacity. And I'm now not just talking from a competition regulatory point of view, I'm talking from the point of view of the very reason why AFCFTA was established and the BRICS cooperation, why is it so important, this cooperation? If it's to build capacity, there's lessons we can learn from BRICS just by doing a few things. The first one is to develop a grain market information system where we think about forecasting the production, the availability, the utility, the demand, the supply of grain throughout BRICS countries and African countries. And so far with AFCFTA, we've been speaking amongst ourselves, not really taking this information to where it's needed, the SMMEs. And if we want to change the unemployment trajectory, the GDP, the inclusive growth trajectory, we need to build capacity of private enterprises. And that private sector requires mechanisms such as cooperatives. So this grain exchange can be built by promoting developments such as a certified grain warehouse and build capacity around that and have advocacy that reaches the people that need it more to secure the grain and to secure feed and other inputs that grain facilitates. And other than that, we really need to revisit the cooperative infrastructure in South Africa, because so far we are not leveraging on the ability of a cooperative to assist in cooperation, in collaboration. And I see opportunity of a grain exchange infrastructure developed using cooperatives, market information systems, capacity building. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Prof. Okay, so we have around 10 minutes still left. So if there are any other questions from the audience, we do have time. Any other questions?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, please go ahead.
Hi. Thank you to the panel. My name is Tabi Soposo. I'm from the Competition Tribunal. My question is to the professor. Thank you, Professor, for the presentation. In your presentation, you mentioned trade creation and trade divergence, and I think you mentioned using the quantitative research, using AFDB, African Development Data, from 2020 to 2024. The question that I have is, what informed, it's a 5-year period, 2020 to 24. I'm just curious as to what informed a 5-year period over, say, a longer period. I do get that the free trade agreements was implemented in 2019, I think, but you're welcome to correct me. I think the first actual shipment, though, was last year in January, the 31st of January. So I'm just interested in finding out the time period, what informed the time period. I think also, just on that, you do have countries that trade through AFCFTA under that agreement, and there's also countries in Africa that trade under other free trade agreements, such as the SADC or the EAC. How is it, or how are you able to distinguish or differentiate which agreements was used to trade? Are these countries trading under AFCFTA agreements or under SADC protocol or EAC? And I think just the last question is, since you started, the data starts in 2020, how did you account for, say, structural changes or base effects, given that that time you might have a low base effects because of COVID-19? So by virtue of your findings, there would potentially be, they might distort the conclusion. But yeah, I think that's just what I'm interested in, the quantitative stuff. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So what we did, we looked at the secondary data provided by a number of authors that use computable general equilibrium modeling. And the time period between 2020 and 2024 was determined precisely for the reasons that you've mentioned, that the agreement was assented to in 2019. But what we have noticed, because, and which touches on question 2 and 3, the intra-Africa trade didn't take place for the first time in 2019. It took place long before that. So the 5 regional economic communities, such as EA, East African Community, COMESA, etc., were the building blocks of that. And there has been quite a strong trend, upward trajectory in terms of intra-regional community trade, number 1 being East African communities. They have really integrated better than most of us. SADC, we know that it trades largely with the US and with Europe and Asia. So the analysis that we did is not just AFCFTA, but it is a combination of, we looked at a combination of studies, capturing the welfare effects of different regions. And our observation was informed the results that we discussed.
Excellent. Thank you, Professor. We're going to move on to concluding remarks. Tandona, please go ahead. We can allow one more question.
I'll be quite brief. My question is to Grace. Grace, on this chart of yours, and you might have said it, but maybe just to clarify, what explains this kind of moment round about mid-2021 where you see the jumps? I mean, explanation that you see for why you kind of have this big jump in the comparative prices for day-old chicks, and then, of course, the corresponding maybe lagged jump in the broiler feed prices, etc. Was there anything in particular that happened in the region or in a particular country that kind of gave rise to that? I might have missed it earlier. And then just a quick comment. I mean, on your paper, Arthur, I mean, it's interesting that I think the power framework that Grace refers to, the kind of Dallas Ponte Sturgeon one of those blocks in that quadrant also deals with this issue of constitutive power, this kind of collective action. You know, when society, like in Europe, says we collectively want greener production for the future of our kids, kind of thing. And similarly, the AFCFTA, in a sense, presents an opportunity for establishment of kind of really strong constitutive power as it relates to mega mergers, but also trade-related barriers that restrict competition in the region. And so I think there's going to come a time where that framework will help us explain and point to ways to deal with mega transactions. And so, for instance, the ways in which, when these transactions are announced, you could set up as authorities that there will be certain types of information, certain types of posturing, even by authorities, when these transactions are coming to say, Africa is looking at this. And you might even have certain different kind of pragmatic, creative ways of having collective information revealed by the firms about a continental impact of a merger like this. COMESA could obviously do it much more easily because they can ask for that sort of information. I think at the level of individual authorities, for instance, South Africa, I think we can go further. I mean, I've sat on a couple of these SABIC type transactions. We could go further in terms of the information we ask on net exports and that of the firm. So we usually say, they don't have a lot of presence, it's a highly competitive global market, and we close it off. And I realize that the kind of egg is on our face as well on this. But we could ask for information and reveal that in reasons to simply contextualize the firms that we're dealing with, because that information then builds this kind of collective understanding in the continent of these mega mergers. I think information is really key, because I think you make the important point that there's a divide and conquer that they do, right? Zambia simply doesn't know what was said to Zimbabwe when these mergers are filed, and then we're kind of none the wiser, because I think that's a really important point. Yeah, let me leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Thando. So over to you, Grace, and then Arthur.
Sure. Thanks, Thando, for that question. It's actually very interesting. So I'll go back 3 years prior to this is when Zambia really comes up as this hub where there are these investments that are taking place into day-old chick supply in Zambia. And then that is followed by, so there's investments taking place, production grows quite dramatically, followed by significant exports into the region. Just before you see the price increases in the day-old chicks in Zambia is when a merger was concluded between Aviagen and I forget the other company, but essentially one of the main suppliers for day-old chicks buys up capacity in Zambia. Following that merger is when you start to see these significant price increases. And that is then linked to also, because of the links to the soya processing and to the feed production, the feed prices also see then the subsequent increases. So in terms of the day-old chicks, Malawi's prices are already quite stagnant at this very high level. So they are already receiving discriminatory prices from Zambia. And then this followed on, you can see the sharp increase in Kenya as well. And then Zambian producers also started to experience this. So the moment that I pinpoint here is where the merger was concluded, which then led to the subsequent increases.
Excellent. Thank you, Grace.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Vilakazi, for that comment. And I think that's precisely the point, that there is scope, even within the current context, to do a bit more and to ask the questions, because I think what you are trying to do is to highlight, to say this is where the problem lies, and perhaps even with the current context, there's more that could be done to be able to make sure that we understand the dynamics that are at play. So I think that's an important point that will actually furthermore elaborate on, and then including the sum of our combinations in line of other comments as well. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much for your questions. So in conclusion, some concluding remarks. The research certainly highlights the importance of a farmer-centric, the need for a farmer-centric solutions to address competition issues in the agricultural sector, and that includes the design of supplier development programs. Those must address the farmers' needs so that they can grow and remain sustainable. Also, the increasing importance of considering cross-border implications of agricultural mergers. a regional perspective of the firm's activities and cross-border value chains. The African Continental Free Trade Area Protocol of Competition Policy might just be the strategic policy lever to unlock a coordinated framework or platform for competition authorities in Africa to manage issues with a continental scope. And likewise, similar protocols in the BRICS and other continents could achieve the same. I want to thank the speakers, our thought leaders, and also the discussants for your knowledge sharing. It moves us forward. And we've now come to the end of the session. It is almost 1:30, so we're right on time for lunch. If you can, please join us after lunch back here at 2:30 for the final panel sessions. Thank you very much for your participation.